Have you ever had your own brother declare in front of a crowd that he would take over the company you built with your blood and tears? Welcome to Family Ashes, where family secrets burn to ashes. If your parents always saw diplomas as more important than real achievements, would you choose to stay silent in humiliation, or stand up and demand respect? Share your thoughts in the comments, because I believe many of us have been judged unfairly, just for not following the perfect path our families laid out. Have you ever had your own brother declare in front of a crowd that he would take over the company you built with your blood and tears? I went through that moment, and it didn't happen in some small corner, but right in the middle of a lavish party, where all the most powerful faces in the tech world were present. Welcome to Family Ashes, where family secrets burn to ashes. If your parents always saw diplomas as more important than real achievements, would you choose to stay silent in humiliation, or stand up and demand respect? Share your thoughts in the comments, because I believe many of us have been judged unfairly, simply because we didn't follow the perfect path our families had mapped out. My name is Olivia Harper. I grew up in Denver, Colorado, in a family where every value revolved around one word: credentials. My father was an economics professor at the University of Colorado, a man who believed that academic prestige was the only measure of success. My mother was a homemaker, but her ambitions for her children were greater than those of any businessperson out there. And then there was Ethan, my brother. From childhood, he was the star the whole family worshipped: perfect grades, a smooth path paved to Harvard, and later the MBA diploma my parents proudly displayed in photos to show their friends during every holiday. The day he joined a prestigious consulting firm, the family treated it as their greatest source of pride. And me? I was just Olivia, the girl who liked tinkering with computers, who dropped out of community college to bury herself in an old garage, where the smell of burned circuits clung to my hair and my clothes. My parents called it a waste of youth. My brother looked at me like a joke. I still remember the exact words he said: "The day I decided to take my own path, you'll always be a failure in the garage. When you get tired, I'll be kind enough to give you a job in the mail room at my company." I stayed silent that day. But in that silence, I swore to myself that I would build something they could never ignore. They wanted diplomas, but I chose another path: to create real value. And that path led me to the bitter confrontation of my life. From the time I was little, I knew I was different. While my brother Ethan could easily memorize economic formulas and solve page-long equations, I only found joy in taking apart an old computer, and then putting it back together so it worked even better than before. In my house, that was never respected. The Harper family valued education so much it was almost a religion. My father, a professor of economics, believed every door opened with a prestigious degree. My mother dreamed of the day she could boast to her friends, "Both of my children are PhDs, professors, or at least CEOs with MBAs." I was the only one who strayed from that path. I didn't chase titles, didn't dream of Harvard, and wasn't interested in the classes everyone else called the only road to success. I loved spending hours in front of a computer screen, staring at lines of code that looked meaningless to others but could turn into a smooth-running program under my hands. In their eyes, I was the odd one. And in my family, being different meant being a failure. I remember one time, when Ethan had just been accepted to Harvard, the whole family threw a party as if he had just won a Nobel Prize. And me? I sat quietly in the corner with my old laptop, struggling to fix a broken line of code. My father looked at me, sighed, and said, "Olivia, you need to be more serious. The path you're on will only bring shame to this family." My mother added, softly but sharp as a knife, "Look at your brother, that's the real future." They didn't know that every word felt like a mark carved into my heart. I had grown used to the comparisons, used to being seen as the one not good enough just because I didn't choose Harvard. But familiarity didn't dull the pain. It only made the fire inside me burn stronger. They thought I would always be a shadow next to my brother. But the moment they turned their backs, I swore to myself, I would build something no diploma could ever match. Something that would force them to look at me, whether with fear in their eyes, or with belated recognition. When Ethan stepped into Harvard, the whole family lived in a drunken haze of victory. They called it the American dream being rewritten in the Harper household. Every dinner conversation revolved around what he would study, which professors he would meet, what job opportunities were waiting for him. Every word of praise for him was another knife twisting deeper into my silence. And me? I quietly packed my things, walked away from community college, and decided to abandon the so-called only salvation they believed in. The day I told them I would start a business from the garage, my mother burst into tears, while my father turned away in silence, not even looking at me once. In their eyes, I hadn't just made a mistake, I had betrayed the expectations they had built their entire lives around. Ethan came home for spring break in his bright red Harvard jacket. He smiled, that arrogant smile I knew too well. "Olivia, every family needs a failure to be the cautionary tale. Congratulations, you just took that role." He even patted my shoulder as if granting me pity, then joked, "Don't worry, when I become the CEO of a Fortune 500 company, I'll let you work in the mailroom. At least the Harper name will be on your badge." That night, I sat alone in the garage, the yellow light casting shadows over unfinished circuit boards, old computers, and the acrid smell of solder. I didn't cry. I just felt my whole body tighten, as if carving his words into my blood. And in that very moment, I swore, I would build something that would make them never dare call me a failure again. But the road I chose was not lined with roses. I ate cheap canned noodles day after day, fell asleep slumped on a broken chair instead of a bed. Friends drifted away, unable to understand why I had abandoned a real opportunity to chase a delusion. My family treated me like a stain to be hidden. Yet in the middle of those long nights, I began to see a gap no one else noticed. Small businesses in Denver were desperate for a simple, affordable cybersecurity solution, while big corporations focused only on selling overpriced products to other giants. I knew that was the only door I had. And I decided to walk through it, even if everyone else believed I would collapse. There are memories that never fade. For me, it wasn't some major event, but just one seemingly harmless sentence from my brother. "When you get tired of that garage, I'll be kind enough to let you work in the mail room at my company." Ethan said that when the whole family was gathered in the dining room, the lights shining bright, the table full of dishes to celebrate his acceptance to Harvard. His voice rang out amid the laughter, light as if it were a joke, but everyone laughed along. My father gave a slight nod, his lips curling up a little, and my mother just let out a small tsk before turning to pick up more food for him. No one defended me. Not a single look of respect was cast in my direction. I sat there, quietly holding my chopsticks, trying to pick up a piece of vegetable to hide my trembling hands. I didn't say anything, but inside I felt as if someone had carved a single word deep into me with a knife: failure. I felt like a stranger in the very house I grew up in. That night, I went back to the garage. The cramped room was filled with the smell of rust and dust. Circuit boards lay scattered everywhere, a few old computers clattered as if ready to die. I sat alone under the weak yellow bulb, the dim light casting my shadow on the stained wall. In that moment, loneliness swallowed me whole. I remember asking myself, were they right? Am I just wasting my youth, turning my life into a joke? And then, just as tears threatened to fall, I clenched my fists so tight that blood welled in my palms. I whispered to myself, "No. If they think I'm only fit to sit in a mailroom, then I'll build an empire that forces them to sign contracts under my name. If they think I'm just a failure in a garage, then I'll turn this garage into the foundation of a company no Harvard degree could ever match." That night, I swore I would succeed. Not to please them, but to force them to look me straight in the eye, with respect, with fear, or with bitter silence. That tiny garage, the place they mocked, the place Ethan called a child's game, would become the place that rewrote the Harper family's story. And I would never forget the vow I made to myself. The first years after leaving community college felt like a cruel experiment. I rented a small office on the second floor of an old building, its walls peeling, the ceiling leaking whenever it rained. That room was both my workplace and my bedroom. I had no money for a bed, only a swivel chair with broken armrests. Many nights, I fell asleep slumped over it, my back aching, my neck so stiff I could barely turn it the next morning. My meals were instant noodles from the discount aisle at the supermarket. I ate so many that I stopped tasting them. Often, when I peeled back the lid and saw the steam rise, I would laugh bitterly. This was the only feast I could throw for myself. Meanwhile, all it took was a glance at social media to see Ethan raising a glass of red wine, smiling brightly among tailored suits in Boston. Same Harper bloodline, but our fates couldn't have been more cruelly different. I once thought at least my parents would be on my side. But no. My father stayed cold. Every time I mentioned the project, he waved me off. "You're wasting your time." My mother sighed, saying I was clinging to an illusion that one day I would wake up and return to the right path. And Ethan, every time he came home, wore that half smile and said, "You're still in that garage? By now you should have applied to Harvard like Mom wanted." I gritted my teeth and endured it all. By day I went out to meet small clients one by one, and by night I sat in front of the flickering screen, my eyes burning from lack of sleep. Sometimes I thought I really might collapse. I remember one winter evening, when the wind howled through the cracked window, I shivered in a thin coat. The room was so cold that my breath turned into white mist. But I still sat there, typing line after line of code, because I knew if I stopped, everything would fall apart. Then opportunity came when I least expected it. A small print shop owner in Denver asked me to check his computer system. While we talked, he sighed and said his company had just lost all their customer data due to a cyber attack. The cost of hiring professional security services was far beyond their means. I remembered the desperation in his eyes, the eyes of a man who only wanted to keep his small business alive. In that moment, an idea flashed in my mind: why not create a simple, easy-to-use, affordable security solution so small businesses like his would no longer be abandoned? I knew this was the market gap the big corporations had ignored. I began writing the first lines of code for the product I would later call Harpershield. The first version was ugly, clumsy, sometimes freezing when it ran. But it stopped a small attack, and I will never forget the look in the print shop owner's eyes when the screen displayed, "System secured." He shook my hand tightly and said, "You just saved my company, Olivia." In that moment, all the cold nights sleeping on a broken chair, all the instant noodle cups, all of Ethan's mocking smiles, they all became worth it. I realized I was on the right path. Harpershield might not yet be an empire, but it was the first proof that I was not useless, not a failure. And I thought to myself, one day, they will have to acknowledge me. Not because of family ties, but because I created something they can't ignore. Harpershield at first was just crude software running erratically on old servers. But I lived with it, nurtured it with every sleepless night and every dollar I managed to save. From one customer, I grew to 10, then to hundreds. Every time someone knocked on the door of my small rented office, my heart raced, not because of money, but because it proved what I had built was no longer a joke. In the third year, I signed my first $1 million contract. I remember clearly, when I put pen to paper, my hand shook so badly I had to grip the pen tightly so my signature wouldn't wobble. $1 million. That number wasn't just money, it was like a slap across the face of every dismissive shake of the head I had endured for years. I wanted to shout, to run home and tell them I had done it. But instead, I sat quietly in my office, a cheap bottle of beer on the table, staring at the contract with 6 figures printed on it, and laughing to myself. A laugh both bitter and sweet. I thought, maybe this time, my parents would see me differently. Maybe they would finally be proud of me, even just a little. But all those hopes evaporated at the very next holiday. That Thanksgiving, my parents' house lit up again, the smell of roast turkey filling the air. I walked in, my heart still warm with joy. But as always, the dinner table quickly turned into Ethan's stage. My mother went on and on. He had just signed a consulting deal worth $15 million, Business Weekly had put his photo on the cover, Harvard had invited him as a guest speaker. My father nodded along, his eyes glowing with pride. I sat there, quietly spooning more mashed potatoes, trying not to let the clinking of knives and forks drown out my thoughts. Finally, I gathered all my courage and said softly, "This year, my company also expanded into California, and just signed our first $1 million contract." For a few brief seconds, the room fell silent. I thought I had finally done something. But then my mother smiled gently, the kind of smile people give a child learning to walk. "Well done, Olivia. Even without a diploma, you managed to get this far." My father only gave a slight nod, then quickly returned to the unfinished story about Ethan. I sat frozen. The wine in my glass suddenly turned bitter, as if I were drinking their contempt. The joy I had brought to the table became something out of place, like an uninvited guest. Ethan leaned back in his chair, sipping his wine, half smiling, half mocking. "Not bad, Olivia. For a dropout, that's pretty good." No one objected. No one defended me. The whole table erupted in laughter again, as if my story had been nothing more than a commercial break in the main program called Ethan Harper. I sat there, silently chewing a piece of turkey that stuck in my throat. In my head, their words drilled into my heart, well done, even without a diploma. To them, I would always be the exception, the odd one out, the one whose success was worth no more than luck. But inside me, one thing was becoming clearer: one day, HarperShield would not just be software for small businesses. It would become a name that forced this entire family, and the world they worshipped, to listen. And when that day came, I wouldn't need to open my mouth to demand respect. My success would speak for itself. HarperShield was no longer confined to small print shops or little stores in Denver. After that first $1 million contract, I threw myself into work like someone possessed. Day after day, I and my small team expanded the system, added features, patched flaws, and then, the product began reaching beyond the borders of Colorado. I still remember the feeling when a tech company in Silicon Valley purchased a full-year package. That moment, I stood frozen in front of the confirmation email, my heart pounding like I was touching a dream for the first time. Silicon Valley, the place my father always referred to as the holy land of innovation. And now, the software he had once called a child's game in the garage was being trusted by corporations there. The company grew. I had a new office, employees, a sign glowing on the street. But strangely, every time I walked into my parents' house, I still felt like nothing more than a faded shadow. Because while I quietly expanded HarperShield nationwide, Ethan rose like a star. He was promoted to partner at a prestigious consulting firm, his face on the cover of economic magazines scattered across airport coffee tables. Every time my father saw one, he would hold it up like a trophy. This is a career. This is true success. I had my name in industry reports, I was invited to speak at small conferences. But at the family table, my achievements were only decent. Ethan's, on the other hand, were inflated as if he had rewritten human history. Every time I heard my mother proudly boast, "My son was just interviewed by Business Weekly," I sat in silence, sipping my wine, feeling invisible. I had thought maybe one day, if I worked hard enough, they would finally see me. But the harder I tried, the more I realized, in their eyes, everything I did was only a faulty version, because I was not Ethan Harper. HarperShield could save thousands of small businesses from collapse, but at the Christmas dinner table, it was worth no more than a passing nod. And Ethan? All he had to do was wear a suit and smile on a magazine cover, and the whole family would weep with pride. And so I learned to stay silent. Silent as my career grew outside, while inside the house, I was still nothing but a shadow. A shadow forever eclipsed by the brilliance they reserved entirely for Ethan. In my family, every story began and ended with two words: Ethan. At every gathering, my mother would open the meal by talking about a new article written about him, about the $1 million contract he had just signed, or a photo of him with CEOs in New York. My father would passionately analyze the strategies of the firm he worked for, as if he were lecturing the whole family on economics. The cousins grew up surrounded by the echo of his name: "Uncle Ethan is so smart, Uncle Ethan is so successful." And me? I was there, but like an invisible spectator. I sat, scooping more mashed potatoes, sipping red wine, and smiling politely. Sometimes I tried to slip in a few words, that HarperShield had just signed another contract in California, that my product was now present in Silicon Valley. But as soon as I finished speaking, my words were quickly drowned out by more proud laughter for Ethan. My mother often said, in a voice gentle but cutting, "You're talented too, Olivia. But just think, if you had earned a diploma, wouldn't you be just like your brother?" That sentence was like a chain, reminding me that no matter what I achieved, in their eyes I would always be a lesser version of Ethan. Once, at a Christmas dinner, I quietly handed my mother a card printed with the HarperShield logo to announce the company had just opened a new branch. She glanced at it, set it down on the table, and continued asking Ethan about his upcoming television interview. The card stayed there all dinner, smeared with turkey gravy, and no one bothered to pick it up. I had grown used to the feeling of being drowned out. Used to being only the shadow behind him, a shadow that was never allowed to shine. But familiarity didn't dull the pain. It only made me laugh colder, deeper inside. I understood there would never be a place for me in the glow my parents reserved for Ethan. And in that shadow, I learned how to wait. To wait for the day that light would no longer belong only to my brother, but become something he would live in fear of losing because of the shadow he once despised. That night, I walked into the grand hall of the Ritz-Carlton in San Francisco, where crystal chandeliers shone down on hundreds of tailored suits and glittering gowns. All of it was organized to celebrate Ethan, the man just appointed CEO of his firm's technology division. I chose a simple black dress. The moment I walked in, my mother's eyes scanned me from head to toe, her frown deepening. Couldn't you have made a bit more effort? This is your brother's important night. I gave a faint smile. I was used to it. That room felt like an exhibition of power. The elite of the tech world gathered, investors from Silicon Valley, CEOs I had once cold emailed to pitch my product, even a few who were already major clients of Harper-Shield. They walked past me, shook my hand out of courtesy, some squinting with a polite smile. "Oh, Olivia, I didn't know you were here too." I smiled back, but inside, the bitterness crept in. They had no idea my product was protecting their companies, while at this party, I was just the footnote next to Ethan Harper. The clinking of glasses rang out as Ethan stepped onto the stage. He wore a perfectly tailored suit, the spotlight making his face glow. I stood among the crowd, listening to every word he spoke. "Thank you all for being here to share the greatest milestone of my career. Today, I have officially been appointed CEO of our firm's technology division." Thunderous applause filled the room. My parents sat in the front row, their eyes shining with pride, as if he had just been crowned king. I looked at them and felt utterly foreign. But Ethan wasn't finished. He paused, smiled, and then spoke slowly, "And this is not the only news. I'd like to share with you our first strategic move, expanding into the small business cybersecurity market." The entire room fell silent. I could clearly feel a few eyes turning toward me. Ethan looked straight at me, his lips curling into a smirk, "And I think there's no better way to start than by acquiring Harper-Shield, the company my sister built." Whispers rippled through the hall. I saw a few of my clients stroking their chins, glancing at me with curiosity. My mother beamed, whispering to the woman next to her, "Finally, the two siblings will be working together." My father nodded, his eyes glowing with pride. "And me?" I stood there, the glass of wine in my hand suddenly heavy. In my mind, Ethan's old words echoed, "You'll always be a failure in the garage. One day, I'll give you a seat in the mail room at my company." The only difference was that tonight, he wasn't saying it at a family dinner table. He was saying it in front of a hall glittering with power, turning me into a public joke. I didn't scream, didn't argue. I just smiled, took a sip of wine, and gave a slight nod. As the applause swelled again for Ethan's speech, I whispered to myself, "Fine. Tomorrow, I'll give you my answer." That night, I walked into the grand hall of the Ritz-Carlton in San Francisco. The room glittered with hundreds of chandeliers, laughter echoing, wine swirling in fragile crystal glasses. Everyone was there to honor Ethan Harper, the new CEO of the technology division. I wore a simple black dress, plain and unshowy. The moment I stepped in, my mother frowned, pulled me aside, and whispered sharply enough to cut through the music, "Couldn't you have made a bit more effort? This is your brother's important night." I smiled faintly, pressed my lips together. I didn't think I was the focus tonight. My answer didn't please her. In her eyes, I had only embarrassed her further in this glamorous place. I sat in a quiet corner, watching familiar faces from the tech world arrive. Many of them were clients of Harper-Shield, the product I had traded my youth to build. But here, they weren't here to mention me. They were here to raise a glass to Ethan. When the clinking of glasses signaled the speech, Ethan stepped onto the stage. The light fell on his perfectly tailored suit, making him look like the lead character in an American success story. He held the microphone, calm smile, confident voice, "Thank you all for being here tonight. I'm very proud to announce that I've officially been appointed CEO of the technology division." The applause thundered. My father nearly teared up, my mother gripped her friend's hand tightly, her eyes shining with pride. I sipped my wine, letting the bitterness burn down my throat, forcing myself not to laugh at the spectacle. But Ethan wasn't finished. He paused, scanned the room, and stopped right where I stood. That smile, the half-smile I knew too well from childhood, appeared again. And then, in front of hundreds of people, he said, "You've always just been the kid tinkering with computers in the garage. But it's time someone with a degree took that little game and turned it into a real company." Laughter erupted, strange eyes turned toward me. In that moment, I felt like I was 18 again, sitting at the family dinner table, hearing the exact same jeer from his mouth. Only now, Ethan wasn't humiliating me in front of just our parents. He was doing it before an entire hall full of power. I gripped my glass so tightly my knuckles turned white. But I didn't scream, didn't protest. I simply smiled, lifted my head high, to show him I was still standing. In my mind, an old vow echoed, the one I had made in that dusty garage years ago: "One day, I'll make you pay for everything you dismissed." And I whispered to myself, "Tomorrow. Tomorrow, Ethan." The applause hadn't yet faded when a familiar voice rose up. I turned my head, and my heart sank. That man had once been my best friend in high school, the one who sat with me for hours in the library, sharing dreams of starting our own company. Now, he wore an expensive suit, stood up in the middle of the crowd, and applauded Ethan. Then he smiled, turned his eyes toward me. "Harpershield needs a real CEO, Olivia." The whole room burst into laughter. I stood still, my hand gripping the wine glass tight. In that moment, I understood, not just my family, not just Ethan, but even someone who had once known me best, had chosen to stand on my brother's side. I was completely isolated. Ethan waited for the laughter to die down, then raised his glass. "And now, I want to share our first step in this new role. We will be expanding into small business cybersecurity. And I think there's no better way to start than by acquiring Harpershield. My sister's company will finally have leadership with the proper credentials to truly grow." A wave of murmurs spread through the hall. A few of my clients looked at me with eyes of both pity and curiosity, as if they were watching a play. My father nodded, his eyes glowing, while my mother smiled proudly and whispered to her friend, "Finally, the two siblings will be working together." I stood there, in the middle of a sea of people applauding Ethan, quietly watching me. But I didn't tremble, didn't react. I just sipped my wine, let the bitterness spread down my throat, and smiled coldly. "I'll give you my answer tomorrow." Just one sentence, then I turned and walked away, leaving the noisy hall behind me. No one knew that as I stepped out of that room, I had already begun preparing for the biggest showdown of my life. The next morning, I arrived at the office very early. The building was still quiet, the carpeted hallways untouched by footsteps, only the first sunlight streaming through the tall glass panes, shining straight into the big conference room. I wanted everything to be bright, transparent, with no place left to hide. I sat in the chair at the head of the table, quietly opened my laptop, and reviewed each slide. My heartbeat was steady, no longer trembling like in the old days when I was compared to Ethan. Today, I was no longer the one standing in the shadows. 9 o'clock sharp, the conference room door swung open. Ethan walked in with a confident smile, followed by my father and two neatly dressed lawyers. Each carried a thick stack of documents, as if they already held victory in their hands. My father looked at me, his eyes both stern and hopeful, as though he was about to witness me surrender and finally do the right thing. Ethan didn't even bother hiding his triumph. He sat down across from me, pushed a thick stack of papers toward me, and spoke in a voice both gentle and condescending. "Olivia, you'll see this is a very generous offer. Just sign it, and Harpershield will have real leadership with the right credentials to go further. You'll still be remembered as the founder, a nice enough title without having to strain yourself any longer." My father gave a slight nod, as if Ethan's words were truth itself. The two lawyers opened their cases, ready to hand me a pen. They all believed I would yield. I smiled, slowly turned my laptop toward them. The large screen behind me lit up. Every eye in the room turned to me. "Before signing, I think there are a few numbers you and the lawyers should take a look at." The first slide appeared, Harpershield valued at $120 million US, verified by 3 independent firms last month. The atmosphere in the room dropped heavy. Ethan's smile faltered, his lips pressing into a thin line. One of the lawyers bent his head, flipping through the files, his hand trembling when he realized the number they had was far lower. I pressed the button, moving to the next slide. More than 250 proprietary security algorithms, already patented. I paused, giving them enough time to swallow the information. My father instinctively leaned closer to the screen, his glasses slipping down his nose, his eyes widening in shock. Then I switched to the third slide. The screen lit up with rows of company logos, big and small. I read every word clearly, my voice calm but each sentence cutting through the air like a blade. The current client list of Harper Shield. And among them is the very corporation where my brother was just appointed CEO of the technology division. A deadly silence fell over the room. My father's jaw dropped, his eyes locked on the screen as if he couldn't believe it. Ethan turned to the lawyers, panic in his eyes, searching for denial, but both only bowed their heads, flipping through their files before staring at each other in shock. I slowly leaned back in my chair, placed both hands on the table, and spoke evenly. For years, your entire company's cybersecurity system has been running on Harper Shield. Did you know that? Or have you been too busy bragging about your MBA to ever bother looking at what you were selling? My eyes locked on Ethan's. I could see the arrogant smile that had always been on his lips dissolve. His face tightened, drained of color, his fists clenched white. In that moment, I realized, for the first time in my life, my brother was no longer looking at me as a useless shadow. He was looking at me as a real opponent. And that was the strongest answer to all the years of being dismissed. The air in the conference room was so thick it could have been cut with a knife. Ethan stayed silent, the two lawyers frozen, and my father stared at the screen as though he had just discovered an undeniable truth. Suddenly, I heard a familiar click, the sound of a camera opening. I turned and saw a tech journalist standing in the corner, someone who had only come today to interview about a new product. But instead of leaving, he had pulled out his phone and started a live stream on Twitter/X. Breaking news, Harper Shield has in fact been running the entire cybersecurity system of Ethan Harper's corporation, the caption on his phone screen read. I could see the viewer count climbing rapidly with each passing second. The news had escaped this room, spreading outside like wildfire. Ethan turned pale, lunging toward the journalist, but it was too late. Everything I had just said, every number on the screen, had already been heard by thousands out there. My father slammed his hand down on the table, the loud bang echoing across the conference room. You dare destroy your brother's career just to prove a point, Olivia? I turned to him, my eyes cold, my voice low, not raised, but sharp enough to cut through the entire room. Not to prove a point, Dad. To protect what I built. The thing you never recognized, never valued. All these years, you only saw Ethan and his Harvard diploma. And everything I did, you dismissed as a garage joke. Today, I force everyone to face the truth. My father was speechless. His eyes blazed, but I saw the confusion clearly inside them. He no longer held control of the narrative. I sat back, exhaled slowly. Outside, the news was spreading across social media. Inside, every eye was fixed on me. And for the first time, I no longer felt like a small shadow. I was the center, and Ethan was nothing more than a man collapsing in silence. I looked at Ethan, saw him trying to scrape together the last scraps of arrogance to cover his panic. My father's face flushed red, his hands clasped tightly, waiting for me to back down. But I wasn't finished yet. I pressed the button. The final slide appeared, the Harper Shield logo next to his corporation's logo. The words were short, cold. The deal is complete. Harper Shield has officially acquired the entire technology division of Corporation H. The board approved and signed the decision last night. The room felt like it had exploded. Ethan jumped to his feet, his voice cracking. Impossible. This has to be a joke. The board would never. I cut him off, my tone calm but every word like a blade. The board voted unanimously. Because their entire system depends on Harper Shield. They chose to stand with me, rather than with a CEO who flaunts his degree but has no idea about the technology he's supposed to be running. The two lawyers frantically pulled out their phones, checking emails. One of them went pale, whispering to Ethan. "The deal has been confirmed. The news was released this morning. She's telling the truth." It was as if the blood had drained from Ethan. His face turned ghostly white. His hands trembled, his fingers digging into the edge of the table until they turned purple. I saw his lips move, but no words came out. My father collapsed back into his chair, his eyes vacant. He had never imagined this scene, the daughter he had labeled a failure becoming the one to put an end to his son's glittering career. I sat still, letting the silence press down on the room. In that moment, I didn't feel joy, nor triumph. Only a cold truth: the vow I had made in that dusty garage years ago had finally been fulfilled. I closed my laptop, letting the silence consume the room. Ethan sat there, his eyes bloodshot, his breathing heavy. My father leaned back, hand on his forehead, while the two lawyers sat frozen. But I knew this moment wasn't the end. I leaned forward, my voice calm but each word sinking deep. "You have two choices. 1. Resign immediately, take a generous severance package and a glowing recommendation, as long as you leave quietly. 2. If you resist, I will release the evidence that you and your division have used Shield's technology for years while putting your name on it. And when that happens, every business magazine, every business school, even Harvard itself, will run the headline, 'MBA star exposed.'" Ethan swallowed hard, pressing his lips together to hide the trembling. My father jumped up, his voice sharp. "Olivia, you can't do this to your brother. He's your family." I turned to him, cold. Family is not an excuse to steal someone else's work. The moment he stood on that stage last night and called me a garage hobbyist, this family destroyed that boundary themselves. As soon as I finished, one of Shield's lawyers stepped forward, placing a thick resignation contract directly in front of Ethan. A fountain pen laid beside it, silent, like a final verdict. Then I heard the familiar beep from the corner. The tech journalist was still live streaming. The camera slowly panned toward Ethan. The entire world outside was watching. Ethan reached for the pen. But his fingers shook so badly that it slipped, clattering onto the wooden table before rolling with a loud clack. That small sound echoed through the conference room like a death knell for his career. The image was streamed live, broadcast straight onto social media. In the eyes of thousands watching, Ethan Harper, the Harvard star, the young CEO, was no longer the symbol of success, but a man trembling before his own sister. I sat still, saying nothing more. Because sometimes, silence carries more weight than any verdict. The room sank into a suffocating silence. Ethan sat motionless, his face so pale it seemed bloodless. The veins on his temples bulged, but his eyes were empty, stripped of the arrogance that had always lived there. My father was frozen, his hand clutching his forehead, his blank eyes fixed on the contract as if it were a knife driven straight into this family. A man who had believed all his life in degrees, in Harvard, in Ethan's perfection, now unable to speak a single word. My mother broke down in tears. Her sobs echoed through the brightly lit glass room, mingling with the clicks of the journalist's camera who was still live streaming. She wasn't crying for me, I knew. She was crying for her star son being dragged down before the eyes of thousands. Ethan's trembling hand reached to pick up the pen again, his eyes full of despair. I looked at him and no longer saw a rival, only a broken man. At last, his hand signed the page, the shaky strokes etched like scratches forever on the contract. The camera captured every moment. The outside world would see an Ethan Harper who was no longer a symbol of success, but a man forced to surrender to his own sister. He pushed the stack of papers toward Shield's lawyer, then stood up. His steps were heavy, unsteady, the chair clattering backward with a loud crash. He turned his back, leaving the conference room without daring to look at me one more time. I sat still, my eyes following his fading figure. There were no cheers, no triumphant celebration. Only the quiet humiliation of a man once worshipped by the entire family, and the coldness I had grown used to my whole life. That day, Ethan Harper left the company in silence. And on that same day, the boundaries of my family officially shattered. Just a few months after the day Ethan signed his resignation, an email appeared in my inbox. Sender, Harvard Business School. They invited me back, not as a student, but as the keynote speaker for the upcoming graduation ceremony. The topic, Innovation Beyond Credentials. I read the subject line over and over, then laughed. Harvard, the school my father had once used to belittle me, was now inviting me to stand on their stage and speak about success without a diploma. I thought of Ethan, thought of all those family dinners where I had been mocked as the dropout, and accepted the invitation with a calm smile. At the same time, Harpershield entered its IPO phase. On the first day of listing, the company's value tripled in just a few hours of trading. I stood in the boardroom, looking at the green numbers flashing on the ticker, and felt my heart go quiet. I no longer needed praise, nor the gaze of recognition. Those numbers spoke loudly enough for me. Ethan disappeared from the tech industry. I heard faintly that he had moved into real estate in Texas, trying to live a quiet life, far from the place that once celebrated him. The man who once graced magazine covers, praised as the Harvard star, was now nothing more than a shadow of himself. My father was different. He quietly retired. I saw him more during holidays, his hair grayer, his eyes no longer carrying that cold pride. Once, while watching a financial news segment about Harpershield, he simply sighed and muttered, "So it turns out, ability doesn't lie in a diploma, but in what you've actually done." I didn't answer, and I didn't need to. Because in the end, I was no longer seeking his recognition. The truth had already proven itself, in the most brutal yet fair way. The day I left the conference room after that fateful deal, my mother ran after me. Her face was blurred with tears, her voice choked. "Daughter. I was wrong. I was wrong for not seeing how strong you were. But now it's too late to mend things, isn't it?" Her hand grasped mine, trembling, as if trying to hold onto something already broken. I looked down at those thin fingers, the same ones that had so many times pushed me back into Ethan's shadow. And then, I quietly pulled my hand away. Without a word. Leaving only a cold void between us, a void I knew would never be filled. From then on, my family still gathered on holidays. We sat around the table, talking about trivial things, the weather, the food, meaningless small talk. On the surface, we kept up appearances, but inside, we all knew those wounds would never heal. My father no longer dared mention degrees. My mother no longer dared compare me to Ethan. But that silence weighed heavier than all the mockery of the past. At night, I sometimes flipped through old photos, seeing a family once smiling together. There were fleeting moments of sadness, but then I remembered it all, the jeers, the dismissive looks, the times I was made into a joke in my own home. And I told myself, I had chosen the right path. People often say the sweetest revenge is watching your enemy fall. But for me, the most glorious revenge is undeniable success. Success so overwhelming that people are forced to bow their heads, even if in their hearts they never wanted to acknowledge it. And I learned one thing, sometimes, silence is the loudest roar. Because nothing hurts those who belittled you more than having to live their entire lives in the shadow of the success they once called impossible. They once called me a useless dropout. They once looked me in the eye and said I would always just be the girl tinkering in a garage, never amounting to anything. But now? Now those very people who despised me are forced to rely on my technology to survive. So I want to ask you, if your family looked down on your path, would you bow your head and accept it, or turn their contempt into the fuel that drives you farther than anyone ever imagined? Leave your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to Family Ashes to hear more stories that will send chills down your spine about the truth inside every family.